So in the previous video, we created a skeleton application with some tab navigation. We created 4 tabs. We created dashboard, activity, search, and settings. And we can load each of those screens up, but there's nothing in them. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to hook up the dashboard here to retrieve some real data from the Alpaca API. So before we get going with that, I just wanted to remind you that I set up this mailing list in case you want to receive more information and content like this. It's financehacks.tv. You can sign up with your email address, and I'm trying to build a community for people that are interested in developing apps on top of these types of commission-free trading APIs, looking at financial data and other financial technology that's available. I'm going to be discussing this a lot on my channel since it seems to be generating a lot of interest. So let's go ahead and jump in to the application. So we have the emulator running still, and then we have our screens, and I'm going to open up the dashboard screen, and you see that there's not much going on yet. So what we're going to want to do is when the component mounts, so there's a component did mount event, and we can start filling something in here. So what we're going to do is fetch from Alpaca whenever the component mounts. So fetch data from Alpaca, and we'll fill this in. I'm just going to console log it for now, just so you see the life cycle of what's happening. So I'm going to start with using this component did mount event, and we're going to fetch from Alpaca whenever this screen loads. So component did mount, and then how are we going to fetch data from the Alpaca API? Well, Alpaca actually provides an example in their React Native repository here. So if you go to this address, I'm going to kind of copy the patterns they used here in order to access the data. So they provided some JavaScript code, and it looks like they use a node package called apisauce. So I'm going to use that as well. And it looks like it's just a wrapper around any API. So you can just define what the headers look like, a base URL, and a timeout. And so you can create an instance of an API, and then you can just create some methods here and just specify the URL routes that you want to hit. And so you can do api.get, post, patch, and so forth. Makes it very simple to call an API with a few lines of code. So we're going to do that as well. So I'm going to install that API sauce library. So to do that, I'm going to go to my command line, and I'll go ahead and stop my packager, and then I'm going to install API sauce. So I found the GitHub repository for it here. And what you want to do is do npm I API sauce. And so I'll just paste that in here, and that's going to download the API sauce package. And then we'll be able to use that in our code. So it looks like that's done, and I can start up again and get my Expo app running. And then I'm going to create a config file at the top level here that'll have my API keys for Alpaca. So let's do a new file here, and I'm going to call it config.js, and that'll live right there. And so what do we need in our config? We can do const config equals, and we need an Alpaca API key ID, and that'll be some value we copy. And then we'll have an Alpaca API secret key, and that'll be another constant value that we can load in our app. Our settings, if we distribute this app to other people, we'll eventually want to have these keys and secrets be something that can be entered by the user. So we could have that be part of the settings screen. You can enter your credentials. That way, not everyone has to open up the code and enter these keys. For now, we're just going to put it in a config file and load it, since we're the only ones using the app at the moment. And then we're going to put a base URL. And Alpaca has, if you remember from a previous video, it has both a live trading API and a paper trading API. So while we're testing, we're going to want to start with the paper trading API, and that one's prefixed with paper and a hyphen. And then if I do alpaca.markets/, that'll be our base URL. And I'm going to fill in my API key and secret key. I'm not going to, actually I can show you what this one is because I'm just using the paper trading API for now. So I'll just do view, and I can just regenerate a key here from an API key, copies it to the clipboard, and I can regenerate this anytime. And then I have a secret key, copy to the clipboard, and now that is all filled in. And so I'm going to export this config so that I can import it in another file. And that's all I need for my configuration there. The next thing I'll do is create a services folder. and that's going to be where we create any of our files for accessing third-party APIs. So I'm going to call this services, and then I'm going to create one called Alpaca. It's possible we're going to interact with other services like IEX Cloud because that has a lot of financial data. So I'm going to leave it open to creating multiple services. So I have a blank file called Alpaca.js now. And what I'm going to do here is import apisauce from apisauce. It looks like I have an extra S that I'll get rid of. And I'm going to import my config as well. And you see it should find it when I import it. So I have apisauce and I have a config. And then so now I'm going to set a constant. And this is going to be a function. And what it's going to do is accept a base URL. And by default, that is going to be the one from our config file. So we're going to create an instance of Alpaca API, or we're going to create a new function called Alpaca API, and we're going to export that function from our module here. So what do we want inside of this? Well, we're going to need a way to create the headers for the API. So I'm going to do const API equals, and we're going to use API sauce, and then you can do create, and then you pass it a dictionary or an object, and you give it a base URL, and that's going to come from our config file, and then we can give it the headers we want. And so if you look in the Alpaca documentation, you see there's headers called API key ID. So we're going to create this object with the API key ID, and then also the key of secret key. So that'll go in there. And then in our config file, we've already specified these. We have config.alpaca key ID, and then we have config.alpaca secret key. So that'll configure an API with a base URL and a secret key, and then we can give it also a timeout setting, and we'll do 5,000 milliseconds. And that should be good there. Okay, and then next we're going to define a couple of functions on this API and export those so they can be accessed outside of this file. So we'll do get account as a function, and we're using fat arrow functions here. So make sure you're familiar with ES6. So it's api.get, and we'll do v2 account, which is one of the endpoints that they provide. Alpaca provides. So v2 account. So we're providing a base URL, and then we're putting the relative path for the API endpoint we're interested in. And so we're going to also use get positions to get our positions in the market. And then that one is going to use v2 positions. So we have an overall API creation function here, and then we also have two functions that do get requests to API endpoints. And then we can return these from the function get count and get positions. And when we do that, we should be able to import this Alpaca API and call these functions in order to get data about our account. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard screen, and we're going to try to import the services here and make sure that we can use them. So I'm going to import Alpaca API from /services/alpaca. And that should import that API from our file. And then in our constructor, we have just an empty state. I'm going to leave it empty for now. We're going to look at the response that comes back from the Alpaca API, and then determine what to call our state, keys based on the response that comes back. So let's see if we can instantiate or create this new Alpaca API and get some data from it. So I went ahead and left a console log there. So now I'm going to do const API equals Alpaca API. And then I'm going to do api.get account, which I made. And then this returns a promise. So you can do then, and then there'll be some response. And then we do a fat arrow function here. And then in here, we should be able to console.log that response. And we should be able to see some data from Alpaca. So let's see if this reloads, if we broke anything yet. Let's make sure we can connect, because I think I restarted this. So I'm going to click Run Android Simulator. And let's see if we have any errors yet. So it's downloading the bundle. It's going to load on our device. We have a dashboard screen. I'm not displaying anything yet, but let's see if we have anything in our console. And you see that we do. So that actually worked perfectly the first time, which is great. So you see our console log right here in the console. It says fetch data from Alpaca. And look at these objects. We have some API keys. That's our configuration object. And then you have data that comes back from the API. We have account blocked, account number, buying power. So buying power seems interesting. So we'll probably use that. And we have cash. So we'll use that key as well. So in our state, let's go ahead and use those same keys. We'll initialize these to buying power 0. We'll do cash, initialize that to 0. And so they'll just be placeholder 0 until we get a response, and then we'll update the state. So I have cash, we have our buying power, we have our equity, which is the amount that our stock is worth. Okay, and then we also have, what else do we have that's interesting? Portfolio value. And then what else? Buying power, cash. That seems good. Oh, long market value. That's a good one. So that's actually the value of our equity. So it looks like on my particular account, if I look, it says I have 125,000 equity and then 278,000 buying power. If you look at my actual positions, you see I have 157,000 of Microsoft and 28,000 of Apple. So that's about, what, $185,000 right there worth of stock. But I think it only started me with $100,000. So I think it gives you a little bit of margin. So you see I'm up $25,000 here. So I have $125,000 balance. But if I actually sold these stocks, I'd have $125,000. But right now, I think I'm buying on margin. So that's why this long market value is $185,000 right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and display some of these values on the screen. So component did mount. We already know that we're getting our response, and our response has response.data and response.ok. So OK is true. So we're going to probably want to check that. So if the response comes back, if response.ok, then we know we can set state, and then we can set buying power to response.data.buying power. We can set our long market value. So yeah, let's just set all these keys to what's in response.data, data.long market value, and then portfolio value, response.data.portfolio value, and then we'll set cash to response.data.cash. And I might change this to do like a shorthand later, but I'm just playing with this for right now. So if the response is okay, we got the response, and we can set the state of all of these. And then on the dashboard screen, what we'll do is create a couple more views in here. So let's do some more text, and then we'll just display these items. So we have text, and we'll say this dot state dot buying power, and then we'll just create a bunch of text objects here, and we'll make this pretty after we dump the actual data. So buying power, so we'll do a label, and then we'll do long market value, and then I'll do text here, text here, text here with a capital T. Okay, long market value dot state dot long market value. Okay, so that's another one. And then let's just do a little more copy paste. Save some typing. Okay, so we have long market value, we have portfolio value. Okay, and then we have cash. Okay, so cash, and then cash, and then we have portfolio value. Okay, I think these will be all jumbled together, so we'll get into styling in a moment. Let me see if this works. So I'm going to look at my emulator. And then look at that. So you have dashboard screen, we have buying power of 278,000, long market value of 185,000, portfolio value 125,000, and cash of negative 60,000 because looks like we've overspent how much money we actually have. So that is all for now. I just wanted to get an ugly screen going. In the next video, we're going to actually make this prettier and add maybe some positions, style it a little bit more, and show some index quotes. So that's it for now. That's how you can call the Alpaca API using apisauce. It fetches using HTTP requests, and then we're just displaying that. We're updating the state of the React Native screen component, and then we're updating our view, or we're re-rendering it with the new state using the data that we got from the API. All right, that's it. Stay tuned for the next video, and we'll make this look better and better. Thanks.